On this January 30th, 2025, we'll slip into the Middle Ages and follow pilgrims, merchants, and messengers along muddy roads and into moonlit inns to feel what travel was really like. Before we begin, please comment your location and your current local time. I'd love to see where and when you're watching. If this calm journey speaks to you, a like and a gentle subscribe would mean a lot. If you think your daily commute is rough, picture this instead. A narrow track that might once have been a Roman road. Its hard lines now scarred by ruts and softened by seasons of rain, until it is more a ribbon of mud than a proper way. Your boots sink ankle deep, then deeper. Each step pulls at leather and cloth. A loaded mule or a cart fights the glue of earth. Wheels groan, the animal huffs and snorts, breath steaming into the cold. The air is thick with the smell of wet timber and churned soil, of animals, and the human sweat of stables and taverns clustered at the roadside. Above, clouds pile up in a hurry. What began as a dull drizzle can become a sudden downpour that threads through hood and cloak and gets straight to your bones. On a day like that, you stop thinking in hours and begin to count the small, stubborn inches a tired foot will take. People talk of making 30 miles in a day when luck and fair weather line up, a generous tally. But more often you fall short. The road floods. A ford turns into a river. A broken cart must be mended or left behind, or you and your companions are forced to halt and make camp in the lee of a hedgerow while a baby cries or an old man's leg gives out. Travel is a continuous negotiation with the weather and with chance. Each mile a minor victory wrested from mud and mishap. There is another constant danger that hums beneath everything. Where the road bends and trees press in, men with desperate faces might be waiting. Bandits do not always ride in swaggering bands. Sometimes they are thin, hungry men who once farmed their land and now see an opportunity. That threat keeps riders paired, makes travelers avoid lonely lanes after dusk, and teaches coins to be counted quickly and hidden on the body. Eyes watch the tree line and the hedges. Every creak of a cart axle, every sudden shout from an animal is reason to tighten a cloak, slip a hand to a belt, and listen for footsteps that should not be there. When night comes, you must find shelter. If providence or planning has favored you, the road will lead to a monastery. Stone walls that promise warmth, a sparse but safe bed, and the steady ritual of monks who take in strangers. There you sleep under a roof that holds back more than rain. It holds back fear. If the monastery is out of reach, the alternatives are less reliable. The roadside inn offers a fire and a bed for a few coins, but its comforts are thin and its company unpredictable. You eat whatever they have, a bowl of pottage, bread, perhaps a piece of salted meat, and lie awake listening to the buildings settle and to other travelers' snores and low prayers, grateful for any shelter that keeps you dry and alive for another morning. This was the rhythm of travel in the Middle Ages. Slow and often brutal, sometimes lit by unexpected kindness, always a test of endurance and nerve. Mud and rain, thieves and fatigue, a hard day measured in weary miles, and the small hope of a safe hearth when night finally releases its dark. Your ancestors did not hurry through the countryside. They passed through it with caution and prayer, and those who survived had stories to tell. They rose before dawn, when the first pale thread of light eased itself over the horizon and the road lay long and empty ahead. For most, travel was not a sprint, but a slow, steady ordeal. Day after day, they pushed forward at a pace that rarely surprised a seasoned traveler. Between 15 and 40 miles could be made in a single day, the exact number shifting with the burden carried and the way they moved. Some trudged on foot, feet bruised and knees aching. Some relied on pack animals, heaving under sacks and bundles. Others rode in wheeled vehicles that creaked and sighed with every rut and stone. No matter the form, the road ate time and left a steady trail of dust, mud, and exhaustion in its wake. Beyond fatigue, there was a sharper, ever-present danger. Roads cut through open countryside and thin woods where shadows could hide trouble, and travel alone was a risk few could afford. The threat of bandits and outlaws hung around every bend like a rumor ready to harden into reality. That knowledge bent choices. Merchants searched out company, small groups clustered together at night, and those who could hired armed men to walk at their flanks. Sound carried in the dark, the crack of a twig, a cough, the slow drum of hooves, and with it came the fragile comfort of numbers. A lone cart could become a target. A caravan, with its clatter and many eyes, was a deterrent. When the day's light surrendered to evening, travelers looked for shelter. Monasteries and inns became stages where all classes briefly met. A monastery door, with its heavy latch and the warm, steady glow of a lamp inside, promised measured quiet and simple food. Inns offered a harsher variety of comforts, a roaring hearth for some, a cramped common room full of strangers for others. What awaited a weary traveler depended on rank. Nobles and those with coin could retire to private chambers, beds curtained against drafts, attendants to lay out clothes and bring a bowl of broth. For many others, the night meant a hard pallet, a share of a bench, or the bitter consolation of the stable where the animals lay amid straw and manure. Hospitality was real, but its measures were unequal, and the line between safety and discomfort was drawn clearly by class. That contrast showed itself most starkly on the road. Wealthy nobles traveled as if the way itself belonged to their convenience, lacquered carriages, leather straps, an entourage of servants to lift trunks and adjust cloaks, a small army of hands to smooth the journey. Their passage was measured as much by status as by speed. Common people moved otherwise, on foot, by mule, in a slow procession of pack animals bearing goods and hope. They carried the journey on their backs and in their hands, weary but resolute, bound to the world by the practical business of getting from one place to another. When what needed moving was not people but goods, the river often did the work. Barges and boats slipped along currents that took the strain of hauling grain, timber, cloth, and other commodities far more quickly and with less friction than a wagon dragging across rutted earth. Rivers carried weight and time with an ease roads could not match, and those who could chose the water. Watching a barge glide past, its mass patient and sure, you could see why. On the banks, the land was a theater of struggle, oxen lowing, the coachman's curse, the laborers bent back. So the world moved slowly on land, more smoothly on water, shaped by the limits of muscle and the constant calculation of risk and comfort. Every traveler learned the same ledger: miles to be made, dangers to be mitigated, shelter to be found, and differences of fortune to be accepted. In that rhythm of dust and river, of guarded caravans and candlelit hospices, the age lived and breathed its weary, honest journeys. I don't see the expanded text. The message contains expanded as a placeholder instead of the actual fragment. Please paste the full expanded version of the road network and transportation methods so I can transform it into a coherent, fluid voiceover script. A few quick questions to make sure I match your needs. Do you want the final story to be about exactly the same length, word count, as your expanded text, or roughly the same length? Preferred voice, tone, warm, dramatic, neutral, scholarly, or something else? Any specific words, names, dates, or phrases that must be preserved exactly as written or emphasized? Target audience, general listeners or specialist history audience. Target running time, optional, e.g., for 3 minutes, 7 minutes. When you paste the expanded text and answer any of the above, I'll produce the audiobook-ready narrative with natural transitions, removed repetitions, and tasteful artistic detail, keeping all facts and important details intact. Many medieval travelers faced a kind of adventure the moment they set out, because the roads themselves were old and changeable. Picture leaving your village for the next hamlet not on a neat highway, but on a ribbon of earth that alters with the weather. After rain, it becomes a long, sucking field of mud where every step threatens to pull you down. In dry spells, it hardens into rutted, uneven ground, scored by cartwheels and hooves. Stones stick up like islands in a slow brown sea. Puddles swallow the reflected sky, and wheel tracks turn into traps that bite at the weary axle. Motion here is less steady progress than a string of negotiations with the road. Prying, levering, pushing, sometimes unloading packs and shouldering them for a stretch just to coax a cart free. Those moments breed a small, resigned fellowship. Men and women swear softly as they haul ropes and shove at a wheel. Horses stamp and snort steam, and a child digs at the mud with a stick because it is the only way to help. Travelers learn quickly that getting stuck is not failure, but simply part of moving from place to place. They tell the same joke to steady their hands and keep the mood light. There is always an awareness of precariousness. A trapped wheel can cost hours, bring an overturned pack, or strain an animal until it trembles. The road teaches patience and a kind of quiet courage, the willingness to stop, work, and laugh a little at misfortune. Weather writes its moods across the journey. Morning mist softens edges and muffles sound. Rain comes like a steady reprimand that soaks cloaks and seeps into boots. Wind fingers at hems and lifts dust ribbons when the sun breaks through. Smells are close and strong. Wet earth and animals, the sharp tang of manure, and sometimes the sudden sweetness of wildflowers where soil drains more kindly. Sounds arrive plainly, the creak of a cart, the hollow clop of a distant horse, the low argument of people retying lashings. All these things keep travelers alert and connected to the landscape, listening for trouble and ready for the next negotiation with the road. When the path opens onto the village square, the change is immediate and welcome. The square may be muddy too, but it is alive with people and wares. Stalls are propped up, rough tables piled with what the fields and workshops have produced, steaming loaves that draw a small, ravenous line, dense salted cheeses near jars of pickles and bundles of dried herbs, rough spun cloth for daily wear, and finer pieces for those who can afford them. Simple metalwork, hooks, nails, a horseshoe or two, sits on display with an artisan's pride. A potter's wares rattle when a cart bumps a stall. A child tugs at a cloak hem, eyes fixed on a bright ribbon. A dog noses a trampled crust while a hen picks at spilled grain. Somewhere a brazier puffs warmth into the chill air. For a traveler, the market is more than provisions. It is a clearing in a long landscape of uncertainty. Tired hands mend frayed straps at a smith's stall. A ragged cloak is darkened again with oil and patiently stitched, and a basin of water offers a small, clean comfort. The market is also the countryside's notice board. People talk about weather and harvest, about the price of grain, about the road ahead. News rides in on the backs of passers-by. Which ford is now deep, whether a bridge nearby has gone down, where a safe crossing can be found when waters rise. A farmer will point a young traveler to a less treacherous lane. An innkeeper will mention where the bog thins. Strangers trade stories as readily as coin, and those mundane conversations become a lifeline to anyone who has stalled for an hour in the mud. There is a kind of warmth that passes beyond the stew pot. Sharing a pot of something hot warms more than bodies. It steadies temper and restores resolve. The market square returns life to a human scale. Faces to read, voices to hear, questions to ask without fear. When it is time to leave, the cart may be lighter where bad bread was eaten and heavier with fresh goods bought, but the traveler departs with more than supplies. They carry chosen routes and the counsel of those they met, small human stories that make a long road feel less lonely. The mud and the ruts remain unavoidable, but the markets between them, places of repair, trade, counsel, and quiet reassurance, are the reason so many journeys go on. As an ordinary traveler, Most journeys meant moving on foot or on horseback, covering roughly 20 to 40 miles a day when you pressed on. That steady pace felt reasonable enough until the weather turned. When rains came, the lanes became treacherous almost overnight. What had been a firm ribbon of earth the day before sank into a sucking, glossy mire, and the miles themselves seemed to slow down, as if unwilling to be crossed. Wheels vanished into wet wells of brown, axles groaned, and a trip that should have been a few hours stretched into an ordeal. Men who rose before dawn to catch a distant market or a meeting found themselves stalled, boots drenched, patience thinning. They stood under dripping eaves listening to the patient, endless plink of water and the soft, maddening susurration of the road giving way beneath them, while the world around them blurred into rain and mud. If fortune favored you and your purse was deep enough, you escaped that misery. A fancy carriage kept you clean and dry. Cushions and curtains shut out wind and rain, and the raised body of the coach sat above the worst of the mud so skirts and hems stayed unmarred. Wealthy passengers exchanged polite conversation while servants fussed over damp cloaks and soothed the horses, a small, shining world of comfort where bad weather was more of a nuisance than a disaster. For most people, there was no carriage to shelter them. They trusted horses, animals that could pick a better line through the worst of the muck, whose broad shoulders bore packs and people alike. You could see their breath steaming in cold air as they strained forward, each hoof finding purchase in uncertain ground. A good horse meant more than transport. It was pride, status, and the difference between reaching your destination and being abandoned on the road. That difference was felt in muddy hems and in grateful smiles, in the quiet relief of arriving dry and the resigned, patient work of those who rode on. When the road turned to soup, the right mount saved you from ruin, tended and prized. The horse carried not just your weight, but your hopes of getting home. For moving goods, river transport was king. Faster, able to carry far more than the jostling, potholed roads. Travelers learned to rely on boats and ferries, on rafts lashed with rope, on fords when the water ran low. Rivers sliced the land into passages and problems. To cross them was to reach markets, medicines, kin. How you spanned that water by negotiating a toll, hiring a pilot, or waiting for the ferry could mean the difference between arriving whole or arriving empty-handed. Sometimes the smartest route wasn't the shortest one. The sentence sits like a well-worn map on a table, folded at the same places 100 times. It promises more than a quick line between two towns. It invites you to trace the contour of valleys and rivers, to notice the places where the land hides risk or reward. Understanding that is less an act of logic than an act of imagination. You must see the world beyond the neat geometry of ink and quill. Picture dusk over a city whose roofs glow like embers. In a dim room warmed by a single lamp, a cartographer leans over a spread of parchment. Ink stains his fingers, and tired concentration sets the curve of his mouth. He doesn't let his eye chase a straight line between two dots. It follows the valleys, the wind-swept ridges, the rivers that cut dark ribbons through the map. He remembers storms that will throw a ship on its nose, bandits who crouch behind a boulder, towns that shut their gates to strangers. Choosing the longer way is not cowardice. It is foresight. To take the extra miles is to choose survival over spectacle. Outside the city gates, a caravan winds along a ribbon of dust, a slow black snake of camels and wagons. Bells jingle in an irregular, comforting rhythm, faces peek from beneath scarves, and every traveler brings along a small cargo of hopes and debts. They follow a ridge that skirts a fickle river, not because the path is pretty, but because it keeps them from being stranded in a plain that turns to mud overnight. That detour brings them to a village with clean water and a healer who mends a child's fever. The bargain is old. Extra days on a road by safety, trade, a chance to wait out a bad season. The shortcut would have been fast, maybe glorious, but it might also have left them buried beneath a sudden flood. On a windswept coast, a captain stands with salt in his beard and wind in his teeth, watching the horizon as if reading a foreign language. The narrow strait promises speed, a straight line over blue water, but it hides shoals and currents that have ruined braver men. He tastes the cost of haste and chooses the longer arc instead, a route that follows the currents, keeps the crew dry, and lets the sails breathe. They will arrive perhaps a day later, but the ship will enter port upright and whole. His choice is not surrender to fear, it is judgment, a weighing of human life against the vanity of arriving first. In a smoky tent, a commander spreads a map and moves pins like pieces on a board. A furious direct assault could reach the objective quickly, but it would batter men against earthworks made ready for such an attack. So he plans a flanking march, longer, less tidy, full of unknown crossings and nights under the stars. The troops will meet hardship and confusion, but they might avoid the slaughter that a head-on rush would bring. On paper, it looks cautious. On the field, it will be the tactic that buries fewer graves and wins more peace. Sometimes the smartest route is the one chosen by a builder, someone who bends metal and stone to a future they will never see. A bridge thrown straight across a river can be raised quickly, praised in a city chronicle, and then collapse beneath the first great storm. A bridge built with gentle arches, following the river's sigh and pulse, takes longer and more hands, but it endures flood and season. A canal that winds to find the soft soil and weakest banks demands more planning and patience. But when the harvest comes, the water moves with it, and generations reap the yield. The long labor is the quiet investment of posterity. Threading these scenes together is a simple moral. Intelligence is not the same as haste. To be clever is to imagine the end when others can see only the next step. To be wise is to measure what you can afford to lose and what you cannot. The shortest line flatters the eye with its certainty, but the longer, smarter path keeps you whole. It is the difference between a trophy and a life. Remember the nights of careful plotting, the slow caravans that hummed through dust and dusk, the captains who looped wide to save their crews, the commanders who marched around danger, the builders who shaped their work for time. Their choices were not compromises of spirit, but acts of imagination and courage, choosing preservation over applause. When you stand at a crossroads and the map lies open before you, listen for that quiet counsel. Sometimes the smartest route isn't the shortest one. The road beneath your feet is no mere strip of dirt. It lives and moves, a ribbon of ruts and puddles that drags your boots and throws your balance. Cart tracks fill with rain, hedgerows crowd so close they could snatch at your cloak, and where woodland leans in the path narrows until it feels like the trees are swallowing sound. Even a horse's low breath can startle in that hush. At the edge of town, the last lamplight fades, and beyond the lane becomes a theater of shadow where every bent tree and roadside mound might hide trouble. Danger is built into the map. Bandits and outlaws wait where the road goes hungry for people. At crossroads, river fords, and the lonely stretches between market towns, they watch for the single traveler, the merchant with a small purse, the awkward figure separated from companions. They take what they can and then melt back into the brush. The law exists, but it is patchy. A castle on a distant hill may promise protection, yet its patrols do not cover every mile, and a lord's reach thins the farther you travel from his lands. Because of that, people learn to travel with care. Merchants link wagons into caravans. Pilgrims walk in long, steady lines. Small parties hire armed men or attach themselves to a man-at-arms. Inns, hospices, and monasteries become more than places to sleep. They are warm hearths, the comfort of other voices, the simple reassurance that you are not alone. Wise travelers favor daylight marches, stick to well-worn roads, and watch for mileposts and bridges as checkpoints of safety. They also learn to read the country. a silence that feels too deep, fresh tracks in the mud, the sudden stopping of birds, all small warnings to quicken the pace and draw nearer to other people. To set out alone is to carry a constant weight on your shoulders. The road will test both courage and prudence. Those who travel smart know that companionship, caution, and a careful eye are often the truest protections against the hazards that wait between towns. If you had money, you could hire armed guards and travel with a small, hard-eyed escort that made the road much safer. Most people didn't have that luxury. They banded together with other travelers because there really was safety in numbers. They took shelter in the fortified entrances of towns or in inns when night fell. They relied on early postal systems that spread word of which routes were safer. And they used coin to secure protection or a warm bed. The exchange of money and the slow flow of letters and messengers turned a lonely trail into something you could plan for. Setting out along those old roads, the first thing you'd want was an itinerary. Not a tidy printed sheet, but a living, trusted guide. Picture the worn slip of paper or the rote kept in your head, folded into your pocket, the small relief when someone handed you directions that could mean the difference between a safe hearth and a sleepless night. That itinerary was a lifeline. It pointed you towards safer bends, the fords that stayed shallow after rain, the ridges where the wind would carry smoke away from you instead of toward you. It told you which lanes to follow to skirt the places people whispered about in taverns and market squares, the crossroads where caravans had been held up, the riverbank that turned treacherous after a sudden thaw, the stretch of track whose stones hid slick moss and mud. Those notes and murmurs saved time and sometimes lives. They were not just lines on a page. They marked practical hazards with exactness born of use. More than ink or memory, an itinerary carried the care of generations. In village courtyards and by hearth fires, elders would point with a knotted finger to a path traced on earth, to a flat-faced rock that served as a signpost, to a cluster of cairns that whispered, "This is the safe crossing." These markers were small human signals in a broad landscape, the kind of details only someone who had walked the miles could teach you to see. They read the land like a book. A bent reed told of hidden marsh. The pattern of lichen on a boulder hinted at the direction of prevailing winds. The flitting of birds or the scent of herbs in a field warned of stagnant pools or of a sudden drop into bog. What might sound like superstition was practical wisdom, honed by long winters and hot summers, by seasons of plenty and seasons of want. It taught you not just where to go, but why one path sheltered you while another left you exposed. So when you gathered an itinerary and fell into conversation with the old hands, you were doing more than following instructions. You were stepping into a lineage of travelers who had learned to read favor and danger in the same breath, who knew when to quicken their pace and when to wait for clearer skies. The map and the knowledge together turned travel from a blind gamble into a practiced negotiation with place, weather, and the unseen hazards that always lingered just beyond the next bend. The king's main roads carried a promise of safety, wider tracks where patrols passed, milestones marked the way, and inns were more trustworthy. But even these well-trod arteries required a careful eye. Step off into the narrow lanes, the rutted back roads and forgotten byways, and the world changed. Cartwheels clattered over uneven stones, shadows pooled beneath hedgerows, and the silence could be a signal. Those lesser-traveled paths were not only bumpy and poorly kept, they were chosen hiding places for troublemakers who watched for lone travelers and lightened packs with swift, practiced hands. To meet that risk, communities often organized communal watches, neighbors taking turns on the road and at the inns to deter theft and to make journeys a little less lonely and a lot less dangerous. I'm ready to turn that fragment into a vivid audiobook-ready narrative, but I don't have the factual content I need to expand. The text you gave me is only a repeated heading. 5. Accommodation and hospitality along the way. To expand it fivefold without inventing events or dates, I need the original fragment that contains the facts, dates, and key events you want preserved. If you don't have that passage handy, tell me the time period and place. For example, medieval Europe, 19th century American West, Silk Road caravanserais. The key facts, dates, people, or events that absolutely must be included, the narrator's voice you prefer, warm, formal, dramatic, neutral, and any length target, an approximate word count or minutes of audio. If it helps, here's how I will approach the expansion once you supply the fragment. I will preserve every factual detail, date, and event exactly as given. I will expand descriptions of places, smells, sounds, and weather to create atmosphere. I will deepen character moments and human reactions tied to the facts without inventing new events. I will smoothly connect disjointed pieces into a flowing narrative arc while keeping chronology and accuracy intact. And I will keep the language clear, lyrical, and suitable for voiceover, so the finished piece feels alive, grounded, and ready for recording. Send the original fragment or the factual details, and I'll produce the five-fold polished narrative. When night fell on the road during a medieval journey, finding a safe place to rest became urgent. You weren't alone in that search. Travelers of every sort weighed their options by social standing and luck, but for the penniless wayfarer or a hungry family with only a few coins and a tired child, the thick stone walls of a monastery promised something rare: bread, heat, and a bed where a body could finally be put down without questions or scorn. Approaching up a slope, the sight of a bell tower cut against the darkening sky could feel like an answer. Through the gateway, a different world opened. A porter or a brother would step forward with a steady, practiced kindness that never felt measured. Guests were led into a common hall where a long table waited with plain, honest food: coarse bread, steaming broth, perhaps a hunk of cheese or some fruit. Lanterns swung gently, the kettle hissed, and low voices rose in a murmur. Strangers on the road settled together and by candlelight traded stories, prayers, and the small comforts of human company. Humility and order shaped the welcome. There was a certain discipline to it. No flashy hospitality, but a calm, dependable routine that made strangers feel received rather than inspected. The food mattered, but even more powerful was the experience of being accepted, the tiredness and troubles acknowledged by hands that offered refuge as a matter of duty and compassion. To be given a bowl, a blanket, a corner by the fire without having to prove your worth was for many the real gift. Beyond shelter from wind and rain, the monastery had a life that offered meaning to passing guests. The slow swell of chant in the chapel could turn exhaustion into a kind of stillness, voices rising and falling, the lighting of candles, the measured toll of bells marking the hours. Those sounds did more than keep time. They folded visitors into a larger rhythm, a practiced devotion that made the cloister feel like a refuge, not only for the body, but for the spirit. Attached to the cloister were infirmaries and hospices where care was practical and tender. Hands soothed fevers, bandaged wounds, and offered small restoratives: a cup of warm broth, a woolen blanket, a kind word at dawn. This help was given without asking for letters of credit or payment. It flowed from the monastery's purpose, a commitment to serve that made healing and consolation part of its very structure. The monastery's influence went beyond its walls and into the surrounding village. People came with produce and news, drew water from the same well, and turned the cloister into a place for markets, council, and celebrations when the harvest was good. Children watched the brothers move through the yards with curiosity. Neighbors came for advice or for prayers at a sickbed. In a changing world, the monastery's daily pattern, work, prayer, hospitality, offered a steady heart that the whole community could rely on. For the pilgrim, then, a stay at the monastery was both practical and spiritual. Yes, it meant warmth and food, but it also meant the chance to bow one's head in a cool chapel, to listen to voices raised in devotion, and to let the weary spirit rest. The monk's observance, Simple acts of tending, feeding, and prayer was charged with sacred purpose. The cloister was not merely an inn for the poor. It was a living center where charity and faith met, where social life and spiritual meaning braided together, and where anyone who crossed the threshold could, for a time, feel that they belonged. If you had some coins jingling in your purse, you could try finding an inn or hostel. Thanks to Charlemagne's efforts, these establishments had become more common across the domain, serving both rich and poor alike, and offering a rare promise of shelter on long, uncertain roads. When a noble set out on the road, the journey rarely began with the noble himself. Instead, a small shadow of the household rode ahead. The harbingers, men whose whole task was to make arrival feel inevitable and comfortable. They came before dawn, spurs whispering on the cold road, canvases and keys in hand, the sort of advance party that smoothed rough edges and turned any village inn into a temporary court. Where common travelers learned to sleep by hedgerows and count on whatever shelter luck provided, these envoys measured rooms and inspected fireplaces, judged the sturdiness of beds, and spoke quietly but firmly with innkeepers. They asked for fresh straw for the bedding, clean linens laid out by candlelight, a hearth banked and ready, and a private table stocked with the provisions the noble would expect. Outside, a small flurry of consequence followed their arrival. Stable boys were set to work with lanterns as horses were led to stalls and hay hauled in. Cooks were briefed to prepare fare suited to rank. A chamberlain's list might be consulted to ensure that the ladies' chambers were properly curtained and that any heraldic colors were hung to mark the family's arrival. The harbinger's voice carried the weight of precedence, a quiet reminder to local officials that this household traveled with expectations as much as with authority. Villagers peered from doorways, children followed the clatter of harness, and innkeepers wiped hands nervously, aware that a single misstep could mean embarrassment or a promised reward. There was both pride and pressure in the harbinger's role. He moved with a practiced eye and a steady hand, taking small satisfactions in a warm fire lit on time or a bed made without fault, knowing that such details preserved reputation and spared his lord the discomfort of surprises. In those moments, the road was transformed, from a string of uncertain nights into a procession of prepared houses, each one temporarily recruited into the noble's world. Sometimes even the best laid plans failed, and you found yourself sleeping outdoors beneath a scatter of stars. It was not the safest choice. Thieves waited in the dark, but there was no other option. A few yards away, the rustic wooden inn promised a warm bed, the smell of smoke and stew, and the soft give of a straw mattress. Its beams creaked with stories. A lantern in the window threw a square of welcome onto the road. Settled at last, the work of travel did not end with supper. In the firelight or the lantern's last glow, you went through the small, serious ritual that separates a wanderer from a fool. You laid out a map or opened the worn corner of your journal. Let your fingers follow routes by memory and by the crooked lines of roads you had already walked. You listened to the night, the rattle of hooves in the yard, the far drip of rain on tiles, a laugh carried from the common room. All of it offered clues about what the morning might bring. You balanced hope and caution. How many hours of daylight would there be? How heavy were the packs and how fresh the horses? You thought of the moods around your table, the patient guide who kept a steady pace, the young rider eager to push on, the belligerent ox that needed coaxing before it would move. Each temper shaped what you dared to plan. You weighed terrain and weather, too. The easy sweep of open plains against the slow, stubborn climb of a pass. A turn in the sky could make road into a quagmire, or a river into an impassable wall. You pictured the places you might reach, the inns and fords you trusted, and the stretches where help would be thin and the nights long. All these reckonings decided distance and speed. You did not press harder than endurance allowed, nor race where caution paid. Setting a fair goal for the next day was an act of care for the animals, for your companions, and for yourself. In the morning, having slept on that choice, you rose and traveled exactly the distance you had judged possible the night before, stepping into the light already measured in your mind. Your daily distance in those old days depended almost entirely on how you chose to travel. If you walked, a fair day could carry you 15 to 20 miles when the weather smiled. Rain, mud, or wind could cut that down to a modest 6 or 8 miles and make each step feel twice as long. Picture instead the early morning light sliding across a well-worn bridle, the steady, familiar thud of hooves on a country lane, and the world waking in a ribbon of dust and song. For most who rode, the day had a gentle limit, 20, maybe 25 miles before both mount and rider needed a proper pause. That was not an exact rule so much as a lived rhythm, one written into muscle and habit. Those 20 to 25 miles were measured in small satisfactions and small hardships. There was the soft huff of a horse lowering its head to graze, the brief warmth of sunlight on leather, the roasted scent of dust and hay hanging in the air as villages slipped behind you. There was also the ache in a rider's shoulders, the rub of a saddle after hours in the stirrups, the slow seep of fatigue into joints and temper. Each mile shifted the balance a little until comfort and strain sat side by side in the saddle. By mid-morning, you might press on with a bright heart and an eager animal. By noon, the pace often slackened. Shade, water, and a bit of level ground where legs could stretch became urgent commodities. The road itself imposed its own limits, and necessity, practical, unspoken, taught travelers when to stop. An inn or a farmyard at day's edge meant more than food. It meant recovery, the chance to let both beast and flesh breathe again. If you could afford it, travel altered entirely. Wealth bought fresh mounts, and with a change of horses, the road folded away faster. Where a typical rider ended the day, the well-resourced could push on to 30, sometimes 40 miles. There was a different pleasure in that speed. The rebound beneath you when you mounted a vigorous, unwearied animal, the sudden surge of momentum, the easing of saddle soreness, as if a quiet weight had lifted. The wind cut sharper in your face, and the countryside blurred into long strokes of color. Privilege was more than arriving sooner. It was conserving flesh and patience. A distant church spire that would mark the end of a common day became simply another waypoint. Towns passed like frames in a moving picture, and yet whether you moved slowly afoot, trotted the usual day on horseback, or raced along with fresh mounts, the road sang the same song. Each mile told the same story, of people and horses and lanes that test you, and of the small, stubborn rewards waiting for those who keep going. Imagine a ribbon of road unfurling across a landscape of ruts and dust, where a lone rider becomes a streak of motion. Professional couriers were the speedsters of their age, pushing through those rough miles at an impressive 31 to 37 miles a day, fast enough that towns would mark their passage and relay stations would be ready with fresh mounts. Their travel was a steady pulse, horses snorting steam in the cold, riders snug in leather, messages wrapped tight and precious against the weather. By contrast, the heavy carts that carried goods moved like another world entirely, lumbering along at roughly 12 miles a day. The same battered roads that let a rider fly punished laden wheels, turning every hill and ford into a test of patience and planning. Oddly, a fragment survives in the archives with only the heading Social Classes and Their Travel Experiences, and nothing beneath it. Historians run their fingers over the blank page and try to imagine the missing lines. Merchants counting how many days to budget, nobles arranging comfortable inns, laborers forced to go on foot when carts were too dear, and servants who watched from carriage windows while the world streamed past. That single heading hints at a whole world of differences, how status shaped not just where people went, but how they felt the journey itself, the convenience of a private coach, the hardship of a shared wagon, the freedom of a courier's road. If you don't have the missing fragment and want a full, richly detailed narration instead, say the word. I can recreate a historically grounded, immersive account from scratch, 5 times longer, with accurate details tailored to the region and era you choose. Tell me which time and place you want. Victorian Britain, ancient Rome, Ming China, whatever fits your project. And whether you'd like the tone to be lyrical, dramatic, or restrained, and I'll produce a voiceover-ready story that brings those roads and their travelers vividly to life. At dawn, the lane out of the village breathed mist, a slow-living rhythm in a world not yet hurried into shape. Mud clung to wooden clogs and the hems of skirts. A dog nosed the wheel ruts. A child sat rubbing sleep from her eyes. In that gray hour, leaving home meant very different things to different people, and the single dirt ribbon of road would show the medieval social order as surely as a market would show its baskets and wares. For the peasant, stepping beyond the manor was stepping into a tightly measured world. Travel was almost always purposeful and brief, to a nearby market on market day, to a neighboring field for hired labor, or to the Lord's court when required. People went on foot or in a slow creaking cart, bundles tied in rough cloth, and a loaf tucked away against hunger. Their journeys were governed by the seasons. Winter froze the ford and closed possibilities. Summer opened paths and fairs. And by obligations, permission from the local lord, tolls and dues that limited how far anyone could stray. Along the way, there was a sturdy intimacy, the smell of dung and hay, the rattle of oxen yokes, gossip exchanged at hedgerows. At night, a peasant might be welcomed into a barn, sleep under straw, or share a common table at a humble inn where ale was warm, beds were hard, and stories were cheap currency. Merchants moved to a different rhythm of risk and reward, stitching towns and coast into a web of exchange. Some hauled goods in wagons across uneven roads, others rode with strings of pack horses. Ships carried cargo down rivers and across coasts, crews learning weather and trade patterns like sailors learn the stars. Merchants kept a constant eye on a ledger of dangers. Thieves and armed bandits in lonely places, toll collectors who claimed a share at every bridge, storms that could scatter a fleet. They organized convoys, hired guards, sought letters of safe conduct at town gates, and traded not just cloth and grain, but pricing knowledge, mercantile practices, and news that could change fortunes before the next port. Their lodgings varied with their cargo. Sometimes the relative comfort of a merchant's hall or a favored hostelry. Sometimes the cramped common room where voices measured trust and suspicion late into the night. A merchant's journey felt like a negotiation at every step, shaping risk into profit in a world where fortunes could be made or lost between two bridges. Clerics and pilgrims traveled toward meaning more than merchandise. A monk on visitation carried the slow, assured dignity of the church, relics in safe custody, letters between abbeys, the quiet of sacred duties performed in strange cloisters. Pilgrims moved with hope that mixed devotion and vulnerability. They bore scallop shells, pennons, or simple sticks. They sang hymns and confessed to strangers by the roadside. Monastic hospitality had a sacred charge to shelter the weary, and abbeys and hospitals opened their doors to those who came in faith. Still, the route of the devout was not free of hardship. Exposure, stolen alms, the thrum of disease in crowded shrines, and the wearying compression of months on the road. The journey itself became a form of penance, an outward pilgrimage mirrored by inward change, and along the way, pilgrims exchanged prayers and tales of miracles that set distant voices trembling in the same liturgy. Nobles traveled like courts on wheels, and a lord's departure was a spectacle of retinue and allegiance. Banners unfurled, horses trimmed, dogs and falcons in tow, servants bustling with kettles and chests. They tended to avoid common inns, preferring fortified manors, castles opened by custom to guests, or kin whose doors were thrown wide in reciprocal hospitality. The noble road was framed by privacy and ceremony, trips for politics, to swear fealty, arrange a marriage, attend a royal court, or for pleasure, for the chase and the hunt that defined aristocratic leisure. But on journeys of war or crusade, nobility exchanged comfort for endurance. Armored men and banners took on the roughness of campaign life, camps rising in fields with the same rituals as a hall, the clangor of training and the smell of smoke and leather bound up with duty. Whether at peace or in arms, travel for the highborn underlined sharp social distinctions at every bend and ford. Soldiers and mercenaries marched with another purpose. For them, the road was discipline and danger, of foraging and of keeping watch. Armies slowed the countryside to their pace. Villages hurried to open gates as columns passed. Military movement required logistics, wagons full of rations, smiths to mend armor, surgeons to stitch wounds when the road finally loosened its grip. In camp, the world narrowed into orders, layers of command, and the constant care of weaponry and supply, a harsh mosaic of routine and readiness. Across the social spectrum, travel was shaped by infrastructure and by the elements. Roman roads long outlasted empires in places, but many routes were rutted tracks, cut anew by each season's traffic. Rivers were often the safest highways, a slow, steady current carrying grain, timber, wine, and people, while sea travel opened wider horizons and larger risks. Pirates, storms, and the marvel of foreign ports where languages and coins were different. Bridges and ferry crossings became points of toll and control. Every gate might ask for coin or a name in a register. At some borders, travelers sought letters of safe conduct. At others, they looked for the welcome of a monastery or the protection of a merchant guild. Seals and respected names could spare one from arrest. Documents were nascent and local, but they mattered. The textures of each journey were sensory and social. Roads smelt of animals and smoke. Inns rang with the clink of tankards and the scratch of lutes. Markets filled the air with raucous haggling and the bright colors of cloth. People encountered music, foreign tongues, spices, and news of battles or plagues carried farther than troops ever marched. Stories and songs traveled with them. Ballads of saints, the latest market price of grain, the rumor that a lord had seized a bridge and raised tolls. Travel compressed time and widened perspective. A peasant might return from a fair with new seeds. A merchant might learn a credit trick, easing distant payments. A pilgrim's tale might inflame a village's piety. And yet the road sharpened inequalities. Some could command carriages and retainers. Others crossed fields barefoot. Hospitality was uneven. Monasteries provided solace for some, but not every traveler found a friendly doorway. Banditry preyed on the isolated, and governors or lords profited from control of bridges and markets. Still, movement brought exchange, languages and goods, techniques and ideas, a slow fusion that over centuries would change diets, laws, and art. When the village woke fully and the mist lifted, all those lives, the peasant with her bundle, the merchant checking his seals, the pilgrim adjusting a shell, the noble spurring a well-bred horse, slipped onto the same road. Each carried different means and different hopes, but each left a small trace, a footprint, a barter, a prayer, a letter, a memory. The medieval road was not a single story, but a braided one, where rank and purpose shaped not only the means of travel, but the meaning of every mile. Nobility traveled with impressive entourages, fancy carriages, and a forest of servants. Talk about making an entrance. Their arrival turned a lane into a stage. Lacquered wheels, brass fittings catching the sun, lacquered hats and fluttering cloaks creating a procession that announced rank before a single word was spoken. It was performance and protection at once. a line of people and possessions arranged to keep distance as much as to display it. When the road unrolled itself from town into open country, it told other stories, quieter, but no less telling. Wealthy merchants moved with a measured purpose, steady hooves, the low creak of a carriage that had been kept in good repair, reins and saddles oiled and cared for. They sat a little higher, looking toward the horizon with a practiced calm. There was no gaudy show, no trumpets or gilded coachwork, just the assurance of people who could pay for speed and shelter, who warmed their hands at a merchant's purse rather than at a roadside fire. By contrast, the common folk threaded the same lanes on foot or atop the simplest pack animals. You could read their lives in their boots, scuffed leather, mud ground into seams, calluses that mapped years of walking. Mules and small donkeys bore what they could, bundles of linen, a pot, a child's scrap of blanket, and every step was economy, not choice. Walking set their pace, their conversation, even how they learned the geography of fatigue and hunger. The road taught them patience and thrift in the same lesson. Safety was never far from anyone's mind. Solitary travel invited trouble, so strangers often became companions by necessity. Groups formed, neighbors, day laborers, market-goers, voices knitting against loneliness and danger. There was comfort in numbers, a shared watch at dusk, hands that knew how to unfasten a stubborn pack, whispered warnings that kept fear at bay. Those small, practical acts passed along the road with the same speed as the swallows overhead. When a route led to a shrine or sacred place, the map of social rank shifted. Pilgrims gathered from all walks of life and fell into the same slow rhythm. Noble and poor walked shoulder to shoulder, footsteps merging into a long, humble procession. Faith redrew the lines daily life had sketched. Shared chants and repeated prayers flattened the differences, if only for the length of a pilgrimage. The result was a congregation of ordinary humanity, feet blistered, garments patched, united in purpose and devotion, gender-shaped movement too. Women of means rode when they could, sheltered from dust and eyes, their posture announcing both status and the protection money could buy. Poor women with fewer options conserved strength and watchfulness by staying close to one another. Groups of mothers, sisters, friends moving as a single protective body. Their solidarity was practical and fierce. Companionship and defense braided together into a kind of social armor when there was no horse to mount. Across weather and seasons, those details, merchants' quiet wealth, the commoner's determined trudge, the pilgrim's mingled devotion, the gendered choices of who rode and who walked, wove into a living tapestry. No single thread dominated the road. Each was essential to the pattern of travel and to the human stories that moved along the lanes, leaving footprints and whispers in their wake. It was truly a case of your social status determining your opportunity to travel. When you picture medieval roads, don't imagine neat lines on a map or a smooth highway. Think instead of a landscape where the road is more suggestion than construction. Soft earth cut by deep ruts where wagon wheels have chewed the ground for years. Gullies that fill with storm water and turn a path into a shining mirror of mud. At dawn, a cold damp seeps through leather and wool. By noon, the same travelers who set out hunched against the chill find their boots plastered with clay. A cart's axle grinds and groans, hooves pick their way, and the rhythmic thud of wheels becomes the steady, tiring heartbeat of the road. The people on that road are a cross-section of the world beyond the manor gates. A noble sits back in a creaking carriage lined with cushions and wrapped in furs, a servant handing up a flask. A peasant walks with hands blistered and feet sore, a pack bowing and bobbing, straps cutting into a shoulder. Between them come clerics with weathered faces, merchants with wares lashed to mules, and pilgrims threading their way toward some distant shrine. They share the same dirt and horizon, but not the comforts. Hierarchy rides with them as plainly as the wind on their faces. Danger never walks far behind. Bandits, men who have learned the cruel economics of the roadside, watch from hedgerows and shadowed copses, timing their raids to the wagging of a coin purse or the moment an unguarded cart slows. Storms can swell a humble stream into a perilous ford, wash away a bridge, or turn a simple crossing into a scramble over slick stones. Ferrymen demand tolls, and tolls can be steep. The road may insist on payment in coin, or in delay, or in humiliation. When night falls, the choice of shelter can mean warmth beside a hearth, or a long, sleepless vigil under the stars. Inns, where they exist, range from bearable common rooms that reek of sweat and ale to generous hospices run by religious houses offering bread, a pallet, and a blessing. Many a traveler sleeps to the chorus of fleas and the creak of bedposts, grateful for the smallest kindness. And yet travel is not only hardship. It is a stream of small adventures, the bartering with the trader over bolts of cloth, the swapping of stories with fellow wayfarers around a fire, the sudden relief of coming upon a village green heavy with harvest, the sight of distant spires promising shelter and water. There is companionship in shared misery, a rough camaraderie when strangers help one another across a swollen stream or lift a broken wheel from the mud. Those moments of help and laughter are as much part of the road as the ruts and the storms. After all of that, the bandits, the weary miles, the nights that never seem to end, it's easy to look back and marvel at how ordinary our modern expectations are. A warm seat, climate control, a diagnosis from an app, a spoken address that the world obeys at the tap of a finger. These comforts make you appreciate the modern car and GPS. Medieval travel taught people patience, how to read the weather and the road, and how much a good innkeeper mattered. Today, most of us simply close the door, fasten a seatbelt, and glide over what once was an adventure.